Episode 48 is a follow up of episode 47. So I kindly request you to first listen to episode 47 to connect with our discussion in episode 48. Thank you and enjoy this episode. As we discussed about this several events, what implications does NATO's enlargement have for the delicate balance of power in the Eastern Europe? Because uh, as we see, not all of the Eastern Europe, but there are like certain territories, even like Estonia. So Estonia has enhanced forward group, battleground group of NATO. It's of course because it is bordering directly with Russia. So from that aspect, and there are some small conflicts which also keep on going on and off. So what is your thought on this? The delicate balance of power, keeping a delicate balance of power in Eastern Europe from NATO's perspective.
Well, unfortunately, NATO has had to do more and more to try to ensure that the members in the East are secure from Russian aggression. When NATO was first beginning this process of enlargement to the region, when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were issued invitations in 1997, NATO and Russia signed something called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which tried to create a positive relationship between NATO and Russia. There was a council created, a form of institutional format for discussions with Russia. And there were, NATO made clear that it would, it had no intention and no need and no plans to deploy infrastructure, permanent basing of troops in the East, because it was trying to reassure Russia, and it wouldn't put nuclear weapons in those countries either, which remains important. But as Russia has become more and more aggressive, NATO has had to step up its presence in the East. Initially it was doing rotating deployments because it didn't want to be the country that violated the Founding Act and wanted to stick with the Founding Act statement about no intention, no need, no plans to
Yes.
To have permanent basing. But you need more and more troops in the East. The Founding Act is dead, so it really shouldn't be a guide for NATO policy, and that's been true for I would argue since 2014. But there were countries even after 2014 that were trying to keep it alive. And NATO's had to engage in more exercises, more more patrols over the Baltic and Black Seas, air and sea patrols. So I think what's been clear is that just as NATO does not want a direct war with Russia, and President Biden's made that very clear. He's said many times he doesn't want to start World War III. He's not putting troops on the ground in Ukraine, but they're going to defend every inch of NATO territory. And just as the West has not wanted to start a war between NATO and Russia, it's very clear Russia doesn't want one either. And Russia has been very careful during this war to attack Ukraine, but it has not attacked Poland, for example, where supplies are coming in from the West. And I don't think it will. So I think NATO's done a good job in deterring Russian military aggression against its members. The problem, of course, is we have this war between Russia and Ukraine that may go on for years to come, and it's not clear how best, whether that can be resolved, whether there's people talk about the prospect for a deal. At this point, we would be asking Ukraine to be giving up territory that belongs to it, to Russia, and we know what happens on Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. It's terrible for the people, and Ukraine shouldn't have to give up territory. And Russia doesn't show any interest in negotiating anyway. So I think we're going to be having this war for a long time to come, and so and that will delay any Ukrainian prospects for joining NATO. And so the real questions are how to try to keep Ukraine secure, the part of Ukraine that Ukraine controls secure in the meantime, and to try to help it liberate as much territory as it can.
Yes, and I believe, as you mentioned, NATO has been successful actually in reducing the impact of Russian influence on several countries in the Eastern Europe, and I think this has been the result of actually a strong cooperation. That's what I believe, especially in the European security domain, because we see not only on the political and the diplomatic level, but we see NATO also leveraging this cooperation to advance its technologies. So, from that perspective, how does NATO collaborate with European Union to address the shared and cooperative, security challenges in Europe?
Well, what's the most interesting aspect for European security in the transatlantic context is the contributions that the different countries make to the European security. There's been a complaint from the US for a long time that Europe has not done its fair share. We see Europe doing, as much or even more than the United States with respect to assistance to Ukraine. But militarily, the Europeans are just not as capable as the United States. And so
Yes,
they
that's
have
very true.
things.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yes,
and the question is, can there be anything? Can the Europeans do anything about that? Will they do anything about that? I think that's something. It's important to recognize, though, when these issues really emerged as big discussion topics in the 1990s. I mean, there's always been concern about Europe not doing as much as it should or could. But
yes,
in the 90s, the United States bears some of the blame because the United States was worried that Europe would develop a separate defense identity, that it would really move towards making the European Union the main actor in Europe. And again, the United States is engaged in Europe through NATO. That's the primary institutional engagement. It's not a member of
yes,
the European Union. So if the European Union developed a stronger defense component, the United States, wouldn't be part of that. And so,
yes,
um, so uh, the and the Europeans, have had such large social welfare programs. They've had priorities elsewhere. They haven't really felt the need to spend on defense. That starts to
yes,
change after the Russian invasion in 2014, and there was a that the NATO countries at their summit later that year in 2014 agreed that they should all aspire to the goal of spending 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024, which is next year. Many countries will not make that target. And now NATO, at its last summit, NATO was thinking about 2% as a floor, not a ceiling. And so, the idea is that they should do even more. But the Europeans are still lagging on this, especially, all eyes are on Germany as to whether it would really become a more capable partner.
yes,
And it's a very important debate in the United States. And certainly, if Donald Trump wins the presidency a year from now,
yes,
he has made clear that he might very well pull the United States out of NATO, which would leave the Europeans are very dependent on the United States for security. We see that dramatically in this war,
yes,
and they don't seem to be making a lot of progress in addressing that dependence on the United States. And I think, we could all be in for a really rough time in transatlantic relations if Donald Trump returns to the presidency.
yes. And as I mentioned, in the previous question, a little bit about the technological aspects as well. So, what security threats, such as like cyber security threats, or even the hybrid warfare, does
Mm-hmm.
NATO's expansion seek to address? because I believe as we go towards you know the NATO's expansion, the Russian tactics have been kind of amplifying, and we saw the cyber attacks actually during the Ukraine war as well. I mean, that cyber attack that was conducted by the Russians, it also affected the other Eastern European countries. So, from that perspective, what are your thoughts on this? Like how NATO actually seeks to, kind of engage or advance or help even the smaller nations which are there in the NATO to help them kind of advance their technological aspects for the security.
Yeah, it's a big challenge for NATO. You had gosh, 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, you had the Russian attacks, cyber attacks on Estonia,
Yes,
and in fact led to the creation of a cyber center in Estonia, NATO cyber center in Estonia. Um, you know, it hasn't been a NATO strong suit to develop these capabilities to address these issues. I think, what your question highlights is there has long been a need for much greater cooperation between NATO and the European Union. Remember, these are two institutions that are located in Brussels,
yes,
but they don't have the level of the cooperation that they should. There's a lot of, I mean, the European countries have a lot of capabilities, non-military capabilities, to deal with a lot of these kinds of issues.
yes,
And I think the development of greater cooperation between NATO and the EU could help in that regard. It's certainly something, if you look at the NATO summit declarations, 2022, 2023, you see a lot of this being addressed. You see,
yes,
rhetorically, you see a lot of this being addressed, a lot of discussion of the cyber issues, discussion of China as well, and the threat posed by China. So I think you still, though, see a lot of what's taking place in those areas more at the national level than you do through the institutional level like NATO. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
yes. And this question is a little bit, I would say, very much general. So, you can actually answer it from, I would say, generalist perspective. So, what is the public opinion on NATO's enlargement in Europe, and how do these sentiments influence national policies? Because when I first came to France back in 2017, and it's been almost now the seventh year is going on, I saw a little bit change in the way the French people are now perceiving, the NATO. It's not that they don't want to be in NATO, uh, but somewhere I think the policies of France have been in such a way that they want their more independent voice, in any kind of matters. So the public sentiments, I think they are not hurt and all, but I think they have evolved and changed a little bit. So, from that perspective, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Oh, um, yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting issue. Again, I think what we've seen is tremendous European dependence on the United States for its security. For a long time, you know, for a country like France, as opposed to countries in Eastern Europe that are right there next to Russia, for a country like France, the Russian threat was pretty abstract.
Yes,
Much greater concern in Europe, of course, about migration coming in from the south, from across the Mediterranean into Europe, and from places like Syria and Iraq and Libya and so on, from Africa. I mean, for the southern European countries, that's been seen as a bigger threat, and um, and I think especially with the Trump years, the first Trump years, from 2017 to 2021, starting to be a
yes,
recognition that this dependence by Europe on the United States is not good. I mean, we've seen President Macron wanting to see the European Union play a bigger role,
yes,
wanting to create a little space there while recognizing how important it is to still have a good relationship with the United States. I think, you know, I think we'll be in very different positions depending on whether President Biden wins re-election or whether Donald Trump returns to the White House. If President Biden wins re-election, Europeans will breathe a sigh of relief. I think we won't see as much forward movement on more independence in Europe, because if they can continue to rely on the United States, they won't have to spend as much. And
Yes.
it's a daunting task to create the kind of capabilities that they would need to create on their own. If Donald Trump wins the presidency, I don't think Europe's going to have much of a choice, because I do think
Yes.
Donald Trump will seek to take the United States out of NATO, in which case you're really not going to have much of NATO, and
Yes.
all eyes will shift toward the European Union. And then the question will be, what can the Europeans do to build up their defense? So I think a lot rests on the US presidential election next year.
Yeah, I think definitely it's a very critical point. And, I think we are now at the end of the podcast. To touch upon the final part of this, I would say NATO's interest has been also increasing in the Indo-Pacific region. Certainly because, there has been an high level Chinese interference and the dominance that is going on. And I see United States especially as one of the key countries involving in conversation with India, Australia, and Japan through the Quad group. And in that, we have seen, a lot of NATO member states through, I would say, several discussions, even in the G22 we saw recently in India. Uh, there have been, a lot of interest of the NATO member state in the Indo-Pacific region. So, can you tell us briefly about what potential threats that could be, or potential conflicts that could be addressed if at all NATO comes in full force in the Indo-Pacific region to possibly interfere in some of the conflicts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we don't really know. We do know that NATO is building its partnerships with four key countries in the region: Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Those countries have been represented at NATO at the two recent NATO summits, 2022 and 2023. 2023, we saw NATO move forward with the development of individual partnership plans with each of these four countries. There was even talk prior to the 2023 summit that NATO would establish a liaison office in Japan, but the French President Macron rejected that
Okay.
idea. He thought it would be too provocative toward China, so that idea was shelved for the time being. But you see a recognition on the part of NATO. And this started during the Trump years. I think initially in 2019, 2020, NATO was responding to Trump's desire that NATO, that European allies take the China threat more seriously, and NATO wanted to try to stay on Trump's good side. So that was part of the impetus. But I think you've also had a recognition in Europe about the growing threat that China poses, and so you have this interest. I don't think that NATO is going to be hugely engaged in
Yes.
the Indo-Pacific. It's far, most countries can't really do much there. I mean, you really have the British and French, and maybe, eventually the Germans will be able to take more action. Certainly at this point, the British and French are the main countries that are able to have a presence in the region. And for example, if China did move militarily against Taiwan, and the United States reacted, that is outside of the scope of NATO's Article 5 about an attack on one being an attack on all. So I don't think you would see NATO respond militarily in that situation, but the United States would expect European political and economic support. And so I think it's
Yes.
really important for NATO to have discussions now about how the institution would respond in the event of a Taiwan scenario. I think for now we
Yes.
will see greater liaisons, greater engagement, military to military discussions, exercises, just an effort to sort of think about how these regions are connected. But I don't think we have a fully formed idea yet of what that's going to mean long term. And you mentioned India. I mean, India is, it's such an interesting country, such an important country in the Indo-Pacific Quad, as you mentioned, with Japan, Australia, and the United States. But has a longstanding policy of avoiding
Yes.
alliances, and so that relationship will be an interesting one to see how the relationship develops for India within the Indo-Pacific Quad, and its relationship long term with NATO, given its history.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is an interesting issue, and I believe in the coming years we'll see more and more developments. As I believe, as China's influence has been increased. I mean, the Solomon Island issue we saw, I think, a year ago, uh, where I think Australia has been under high pressure actually because a lot of their economic ties are with China. Uh, so I think we might definitely see. I will be very much interesting to see how the NATO member states actually react to the situation, because I believe even the France has their some of their territories in the Indo-Pacific. So it would be kind of interesting to see in the future how these things develop ahead. I think we are now at the final part of the podcast. So the final question is actually not related to our topic of the discussion, but I believe a lot of students and research scholars also listen to this podcast. So from that perspective, this final question is actually for them, because I believe every expert who comes on this podcast has some of the other thing to actually share with the students, researchers who are trying to actually engage, participate, and create their own career path in this sector. So, and I believe you yourself are from the academic sector as well. So I'm pretty sure like you'll be able to answer this question in a much more effective manner. So, what message would you like to share with student researchers and other stakeholders willing to participate in and engage in defense and security studies?
Well, we need more and more young people to engage and give us good ideas and help us, develop on a better path. So
Yes.
it would be wonderful to see more students going into this area. I actually
Yes.
have class later today, so I will be with my students later today. And uh, the biggest message I would deliver to any student is follow your passion.
Yes.
Your research is going to be best if you are passionate about it. The things you work on, you will do best if you are passionate about it. Don't try to guess where the hot topics are going to be. It
Yes.
things change all the time. Unexpected events happen. People thought, for example, that the Middle East was becoming quiet and there was normalization possibilities between Israel and the Arab states, and now we have this horrific war between Israel and Hamas that started
Yes.
with the attacks of October 7th. So and we see what has happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think people, as they find topics, take lots of different classes on different subjects.
Yes.
Don't try to guess where the trends are going, but if you find a topic that you're super interested in, uh, pursue it, and just try to go as deeply as you can into it. And if students have a passion for studying defense topics, emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, that's good. We will need that. Um, and I hope we'll get a lot of students who will be interested in those topics. And I'm associated uh, with American University and Brookings Institution and Stanford University, and my email addresses are all online on those websites, and or through my own website at jamesgoldgeier.com. And any student is always welcome to reach out to me. A seventh grader in the United States reached out to me yesterday about wanting to talk to me about NATO. So
Okay.
I'm always happy to talk to any student.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. Thank you very much, James. And it's really I'm honored to actually have you on this podcast because uh, the kind of articles that you had written, I had never seen such a critical commentary again. I'm mentioning this again because that's something that kind of I would say inspired me to explore this topic actually. So yeah, thank you very much for all the great insights. I hope the audience enjoys this episode, and I really hope to kind of record few more episodes in the future as we see more developments in and around this topic and several other topics that we just discussed during the podcast. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. This was great.